The lights of Ward Enterprises flickered dimly against the rain-soaked glass as midnight settled in. The building was empty, save for the rhythmic squeak of a mop sliding across marble floors. George, the 72-year-old janitor, moved slowly, his back curved like a question mark etched by years of quiet labor. His reflection trembled on the wet surface as he noticed the young man walking toward him, sharp suit, eyes of steel, every step confident and cold. Ethan Ward. The new boss carried the kind of ambition that left no room for nostalgia. Tonight, their worlds collided under the buzz of dying fluorescent lights. "Please don't leave me here alone." George's voice cracked like brittle paper. His words filled the hallway, heavy and strange, almost too personal for a man talking to his employer. Ethan froze for a heartbeat, then straightened his tie as if to shake off the discomfort. The silence that followed was unbearable. 2 generations. Standing at the edge of something neither could name, George's wrinkled hand trembled on the mop handle, and his eyes glistened with a fear Ethan refused to understand. But that sentence, those 6 words, would haunt him long after the echo faded. If you've ever heard someone's plea echo inside your heart, then you know how it feels when time seems to stop. Before I tell you what happened next, and why that proud young boss ended up crying like a child, take a second to breathe with me. Stories like this remind us that behind every uniform, every title, there's a beating heart we often overlook. So if you believe stories like this one deserve to be told, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever said goodbye to someone too late? Now, let's go back to where it all began. A week earlier, Ethan Ward stood at the head of a sleek conference room filled with digital screens and restless employees. On the table lay the blueprint for his latest project, full automation of maintenance operations. Efficiency, he called it. "No more wasted man-hours," he declared, tapping on the graph that showed rising profits. The applause was polite but uneasy. Everyone knew what it meant. For George, it meant the end of 47 years spent keeping this building alive. Downstairs, George was scrubbing a stairwell when he overheard the announcement through the intercom. He stopped mid-motion, water dripping from the mop like slow tears. Automation, machines, a new future where people like him had no place. He smiled sadly, the kind of smile that hides both pride and pain. "Guess it's time," he whispered, as if to the walls themselves. Walls that had heard his every song and sigh. That evening, Ethan passed through the lobby, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders. He didn't notice the old man polishing the metal railing until George spoke. Softly, "Good night, Mr. Ward." The tone was warm, respectful, but there was something final about it. Ethan muttered a distracted reply, never looking up. George watched him go, a faint reflection of the boy he once knew flickering in the glass door. Over the next few days, the building began to change. Bright new machines arrived, humming where people once talked and laughed. Ethan walked the corridors proud of his progress, unaware that he was erasing history with every signature. Yet, each night he'd catch a glimpse of George still working, slow, steady, humming old tunes from another time. For reasons he couldn't explain, those melodies stayed with him long after he went home. On Friday, Ethan called George into his office. The room was cold, all glass and chrome. He didn't offer a seat. "George," he said briskly, "your position will be terminated at the end of this month. We'll provide compensation, of course." George nodded, quiet as always, hands folded neatly on his mop handle. Then, almost as an afterthought, he spoke. "Sir, may I stay until the end of the month? I just want to say goodbye to the building." Ethan's pen froze mid-air. That wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Something about that request lingered with Ethan long after George left the room. The word goodbye rattled in his chest like a loose screw in a machine. Why would anyone want to say goodbye to a place? To him, the building was just concrete and numbers. But to George, it was home. Still, Ethan dismissed the thought, convincing himself it was nothing more than sentimental nonsense. Yet somewhere deep inside, a crack had begun to form. That night, George stayed late, polishing the empty corridors with gentle, almost sacred care. He moved slowly, humming an old tune that once filled the place with warmth. He paused at a corner near the old elevator, pressing a hand against the wall as though feeling for a heartbeat. "Thank you," he whispered to the silence. Above him, the cameras blinked red, recording everything, including a moment of goodbye no one else would understand. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan returned to grab a forgotten briefcase. The building was quiet, alive only with the faint hum of machinery and George's distant humming, and then he heard it again, that voice, trembling, human, fragile. "Please don't leave me here alone." Ethan turned toward the sound, heart pounding. In that moment, he didn't know why, but something inside him broke. The story was only beginning. Morning sunlight spilled through the glass facade of Ward Enterprises, turning every surface silver. Ethan stood in his office, surveying the floor below, where workers moved like parts of a single, efficient machine. The hum of new technology filled the air. Automated cleaners gliding across tiles, drones scanning. Maintenance logs, screens flashing data in sterile perfection. To most, it was impressive. To Ethan, it was progress. But beneath that shine, a quiet sadness began to bloom. George arrived through the side entrance, lunchbox in hand, his faded uniform neatly pressed. The security scanner beeped twice before letting him through, as if even the machine hesitated to allow him inside. He paused at the doorway, eyes scanning the once familiar lobby now cluttered with new devices. "It's beautiful," he murmured, though the word felt heavy in his mouth. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was watching the future take his place. Later that morning, Ethan addressed his employees in the main hall. "This is not just innovation," he said, pacing confidently across the stage. "It's evolution. We're building a company that never sleeps." Applause rippled through the crowd, though not everyone clapped. George stood at the back, leaning on his mop, eyes fixed on the young man who had once run through these same halls as a boy. Ethan didn't notice him, or perhaps he couldn't bear to. After the meeting, Ethan retreated to his office, energized by his own speech. He watched through the glass as machines cleaned faster than any human could. "See," he whispered to himself, "perfection." But as one of the new robots bumped clumsily into a wall, spilling detergent across the floor, Ethan frowned. The smell of soap filled the air, the same kind George used for decades. A strange pang of nostalgia cut through his chest before he brushed it away. Down below, George quietly helped the robot recover. "Easy there," he chuckled, steadying it like an old friend learning to walk. No one saw the tenderness in his movements, the way he still treated every corner of the building with care. To him, this wasn't just a workspace. It was a living memory. Each tile held stories. Laughter, tears, and moments he could never replace. But to everyone else, it was just another floor on a balance sheet. That afternoon, Ethan walked past George without a word. The old man smiled anyway. "Good work today, sir," George said softly. Ethan only nodded, distracted by his tablet. But after he passed, he glanced over his shoulder for a brief moment. George was kneeling, scrubbing a spot on the marble floor that no one else would have noticed. It shimmered under the light like a secret only he could see. For a fleeting second, Ethan almost said something, but didn't. As the day ended, Ethan sat in his office reviewing numbers that told him everything was better. Profits up, costs down, efficiency maximized. Yet the silence felt heavier than before. Outside his window, the city pulsed with life, but inside, everything seemed unnervingly still. He loosened his tie and stared at the darkened hallway, where the faint hum of George's mop echoed like a ghost. Progress, he thought, shouldn't sound so lonely. In the locker room, George ate his sandwich slowly, listening to the whir of machines finishing their rounds. The hum reminded him of lullabies from his childhood, comforting yet mechanical, as if the world had replaced tenderness with precision. He took out an old photo from his wallet, a younger Ethan's father, smiling beside him during the building's grand opening. "You'd be proud," George whispered, "but you'd miss the people." His eyes grew wet, and he slipped the photo back inside. Ethan left late that night, his footsteps echoing in the marble hall. He paused near the lobby, where George was still at work. "You can leave that for tomorrow," Ethan said casually. George looked up with a small grin. "Tomorrow's for the young, sir. I finish what I start." The words hit harder than either expected. Ethan gave a short nod and walked away, but the sound of the mop, that slow, steady rhythm, followed him all the way to the door. By the time Ethan reached his car, rain had started to fall, washing the city in silver streaks. He sat behind the wheel, watching droplets race down the windshield, like time slipping through his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't turn on the radio. The silence felt alive, whispering things he wasn't ready to hear. Up in the building, George switched off the lights one by one, leaving just enough glow for tomorrow's work, though he knew tomorrow was not promised. The morning sun filtered through the tinted windows of Ethan's office, cutting across the table like a blade of light. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of a minimalist clock, a symbol of Ethan's obsession with time and precision. Papers lay perfectly aligned, contracts ready to end what decades of loyalty had built. Outside, the city moved with purpose, unaware that a man's life was about to quietly shift forever. Ethan exhaled, straightening his tie. It was just another meeting, he told himself. George arrived exactly on time, his cap folded neatly under one arm. He had changed into a clean uniform, shoes polished, as if it were his first day rather than his last month. When he stepped into the office, the faint scent of disinfectant followed him, the smell of a man who believed cleanliness was a kind of respect. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from him without looking up. "George," he began, his voice clipped, "you've been with the company for, what, 47 years? George nodded, eyes kind but weary. 47 and 2 months, sir." There was a small smile on the old man's face, a quiet dignity that unnerved Ethan. He wasn't angry, he wasn't pleading. He was simply there, calm as stone. Cleared his throat, pressing forward. "You've served us well, but the company is moving in a new direction. Automation will handle most of the maintenance work going forward." George didn't flinch. "I see," he said softly. His gaze drifted toward the window, watching sunlight spill across the skyline he had watched grow for nearly half a century. Ethan continued, hiding behind his rehearsed professionalism. "Of course you'll receive compensation, retirement benefits, everything according to policy." His words bounced off the walls like metal. George nodded again, still silent. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, he spoke. "Mr. Ward, may I stay until the end of the month, just to say goodbye to the building?" His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes did not. For the first time that day, Ethan looked up. Something about that sentence, simple, human, absurd, unsettled him. Goodbye to the building? To Ethan, it made no sense. The structure was just a thing, glass, steel, wires, but George spoke of it as one might speak of a friend. "You want to say goodbye?" Ethan repeated, almost mocking the idea. George only smiled, nodding once. "I've lived more years here than anywhere else. Feels wrong to leave without a proper farewell." The sincerity in his tone hit deeper than Ethan expected. "Fine," Ethan said at last, rubbing his temple. "You can stay until the end of the month." He meant to sound dismissive, but his voice softened on the last words. George stood, bowing his head in quiet gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I promise I won't be in the way." Ethan didn't respond, just waved him off as if ending a call. But as the door closed behind the janitor, the room suddenly felt colder, emptier. The ticking clock now seemed louder than before. Down in the hall, George stopped for a moment and looked around the building that had become his second skin. He could still picture young Ethan running through these corridors decades ago, laughing beside his father. The boy had grown into a man he barely recognized. George sighed, gripping the mop handle tightly, whispering to himself, "I guess time cleans everything, even memories." Then he walked away, each step echoing with both pride and sorrow. Ethan stayed seated long after George left. He stared at the empty chair, trying to shake the strange weight pressing on his chest. "It's just business," he whispered, but even as he said it, the words sounded hollow. He turned toward the window again. The skyline glittered, flawless, but for the first time, it didn't feel like success. It felt like distance. Down below he could see George pushing his mop, moving slowly, carefully, like a man savoring his last dance. Later that evening, Ethan walked through the corridors on his way out. He passed George near the lobby, still working long after everyone else had gone. "You don't have to stay so late," Ethan said without stopping. George smiled faintly. "I know, sir, but I like to leave things shining before I go." There was something in his tone, not resignation, but devotion. Ethan didn't reply. He simply kept walking, the sound of the mop following him down the hall like a fading heartbeat. Outside, the city was alive with lights and noise, yet Ethan felt strangely disconnected from it all. He stood beside his car for a long moment, rain beginning to fall once more. Somewhere behind him, through the tall glass walls, George's silhouette moved across the empty lobby, slow, steady, enduring. Ethan watched until the image blurred in the downpour. He didn't know why, but the words, "just to say goodbye," echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. The building slept under the hum of fluorescent lights. It was long past midnight, and the rain outside tapped gently against the glass like distant applause. Ethan had stayed late again, buried in numbers that refused to quiet his thoughts. Through the transparent walls of his office, he could see the empty corridors, long, gleaming, soulless. Then, faintly, came a sound he didn't expect. A low, steady humming. A human sound in a place built to silence them. Following the melody, Ethan stepped out into the hallway. There, far down the corridor, George moved slowly with his mop, gliding it across the floor like a dance partner. The tune he hummed was old, cracked by age, but filled with tenderness, something Ethan hadn't felt in years. The janitor's reflection shimmered on the floor beneath him, almost ghost-like. Ethan stood still, hidden in the shadows, watching. For the first time, efficiency didn't look beautiful. Humanity did. George paused near a row of framed photographs, black and white portraits of the company's founders. His wrinkled hand brushed the glass over one of them, a face long gone. "You'd laugh at all this, Michael?" he whispered. The name caught Ethan's ear. Michael, his father's name. Ethan frowned, unsure if he heard it right. But George had already turned back to his work, humming again, unaware that his past had just stirred something in the man watching him. The elevator dinged softly, its light reflecting across the marble floor. Ethan stepped back into the shadows as George wheeled his cart toward it. The old man stopped, pressed his palm against the panel, and smiled, a smile full of memory. "You've seen more years than I have," he murmured to the elevator doors, "and you never forgot his laughter." Ethan's brow furrowed. Whose laughter? Something in those words made the air heavier, as if the building itself carried secrets. Later that night, Ethan returned to his office, but couldn't focus. The image of George speaking to the elevator lingered in his mind like a whisper that refused to die. He opened an old personnel file out of curiosity, scrolling through decades of digital archives. George's name appeared again and again: janitor, maintenance, night shift. No complaints, no promotions, no transfers. Just constancy. "Why would anyone stay here that long?" Ethan muttered, almost resentful. But deep down, he knew the answer. Love. Downstairs, George moved through the lobby with practiced grace. Every sweep of his mop was deliberate, as though he were erasing time itself. He paused near the reception desk, where a crack in the marble had always bothered him. Kneeling, he traced the line with his fingers, whispering something only he could hear. "You've held us all together," he said softly, patting the floor. Then, as if remembering a ghost, he chuckled. "Your father used to trip here every morning." He didn't know Ethan was listening from the staircase above. Ethan leaned on the railing, heart pounding. The phrase replayed in his head. Your father. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe George was just reminiscing about the old boss, not realizing who was listening. Still, the familiarity in George's voice gnawed at him. He left quietly, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But that night, in his apartment, he dreamed of laughter echoing through long hallways, and of a warm hand guiding him through the dark. The next morning, Ethan arrived early, but the building felt different. Every hum, every echo seemed alive, filled with invisible presence. He walked through the halls and paused where George had worked the night before. The floor shone brighter there, as if polished with devotion rather than soap. For reasons he couldn't name, Ethan placed his palm on the marble, just as George had. It was still warm, as though holding the memory of the man's touch. That day, Ethan found himself distracted during meetings. Words like efficiency, expansion, and innovation blurred together, meaningless noise compared to the quiet sincerity of that humming he'd heard. He replayed it in his mind, that small, trembling tune, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: remorse. Maybe progress wasn't supposed to sound like silence. Maybe it was supposed to sound like a song. As dusk fell again, Ethan lingered in his office, staring down at the now empty hallway. Somewhere deep inside, he wished to hear that humming once more. But tonight, the building was silent, the kind of silence that feels like absence, and though he didn't know why, Ethan whispered softly into the empty space, "Good night, George." Somewhere in the dark, an unseen light flickered, as if the building itself had answered him back. The morning began with a sharp metallic groan that echoed through the building's atrium. Ethan looked up from his laptop, irritated by the disruption. A moment later, his assistant appeared at the door, breathless. "Sir, the old elevator's out of service again. Maintenance says the system's too outdated." Ethan sighed, already calculating costs in his head. "Then replace it," he said flatly. But somewhere beneath the surface, the decision felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves resisted. Down in the lobby, George stood beside the elevator doors, a worn toolbox at his feet. His hands trembled as he touched the metal frame, tracing scratches he knew by heart. "You've lasted longer than most," he whispered. The hum of the motor sputtered weakly, like a fading heartbeat. When the technician arrived with blueprints for a modern replacement, George shook his head. "It doesn't need replacing," he said firmly. "It just needs to be listened to." Ethan arrived moments later, impatience radiating from every step. "George, we've already ordered the new model. The repairs aren't worth it." The old man looked up, eyes glistening beneath the fluorescent glare. "You can't throw away something that saved a life," he said quietly. The words hit Ethan like static in the air. "What are you talking about?" he asked, frowning. George only smiled, wiping dust from the control panel. "Some stories stay in the metal, sir. You just have to hear them." The elevator doors slid open with a weary sigh. Inside, the small cabin smelled faintly of oil and old polish. Familiar, almost comforting. Ethan stepped closer, glancing at the faded brass plaque near the buttons. It was engraved with a year, 1989, the year his father died. He felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. "This thing's ancient," he muttered, stepping back. George nodded. "Ancient, yes, but it remembers." Ethan didn't ask what that meant. He didn't want to know. That night, the repair crew began dismantling the panel while George stood nearby, watching in silence. Sparks flew, wires twisted, the elevator's insides laid bare like organs in surgery. Ethan signed off the paperwork and turned to leave, but George stopped him. "Sir," he said, voice trembling slightly, "when this breaks, it's not just metal that goes, it's memory." Ethan hesitated at the doorway, unwilling to admit that something in the old man's tone unsettled him. Later that evening, as rain began to fall again, Ethan sat alone in his office. The faint smell of burnt wiring drifted in from the hall. He stared out the window, but all he could see was the reflection of that elevator door in his mind, the one that remembered. He thought about George's words. Saved a life. Whose life? He tried to shake it off, but the phrase lingered, persistent as an echo. Somewhere deep in the building, a distant clang sounded, like metal groaning in pain. Downstairs, George worked alone, refusing to go home. The hallway lights flickered, throwing shadows across his face as he knelt beside the open elevator shaft. "You've seen it all, haven't you?" he murmured. "All the laughter, all the losses." He pressed his hand to the wall, eyes distant. "You remember him, don't you?" His voice softened. "The boy." The elevator groaned again, its cables trembling faintly, as though answering. Ethan returned to the site, drawn by something he couldn't explain. The lobby was dim, silent, except for the steady drip of rain from George's coat. "Why are you still here?" Ethan asked. George didn't look up. "Because some things shouldn't be left alone," he said simply. Then he glanced at Ethan, a small smile forming. "Your father would have said the same." The sentence froze Ethan where he stood. "My father." His throat went dry, but before he could ask, George turned away. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. His dreams were fragments, screeching, a child reaching through the elevator doors. He woke in a cold sweat, gasping. The city outside was quiet, but inside him, something stirred, a memory he couldn't quite touch. He poured himself a drink, staring at his trembling reflection in the window. "It's just stress," he whispered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next morning, the elevator stood silent, its doors sealed with yellow caution tape. Ethan passed by without looking, pretending it didn't matter. But as he walked away, he could swear he heard it, the faint hum of a motor that shouldn't be running, steady and rhythmic like a pulse. Somewhere behind those doors, the ghosts of the past waited patiently, and whether he liked it or not, Ethan knew he would have to open them soon. The morning after the storm, sunlight broke through the clouds, slicing across the glass towers of the city. Ethan arrived early, driven by an unease he couldn't name. The building felt different, quieter, as though it were holding its breath. Passing the out-of-service elevator, he hesitated, eyes lingering on the taped doors. "It remembers," George had said. Ethan shook his head, forcing the thought away. But something deep inside whispered back, "Maybe it remembers you." He couldn't focus on his reports. Every spreadsheet looked meaningless. every meeting pointless. Finally, he opened a forgotten digital archive on his computer, one that hadn't been accessed in years. The company's earliest files appeared, pixelated and yellowed with time. There, among lists of employees and photographs of the building's construction, one name repeated itself like a refrain. George Whitmore, Maintenance Division, 1978, present. Ethan blinked. That was before he was even born. Scrolling further, he found a black and white photo of the original staff. Dozens of faces stared back, smiling proudly in front of the newly opened ward building. Ethan's chest tightened as his eyes caught two figures near the center, George unmistakably younger, but with the same gentle eyes, and beside him his father, Michael Ward, laughing with an arm around the janitor's shoulder. Ethan leaned closer, fingers trembling. The connection felt impossible, yet undeniable. The more he searched, the more George appeared, in company newsletters, staff photos, even safety reports signed by his father's hand. They weren't just co-workers. They looked like friends. One caption read, "George Whitmore, the heart of Ward Industries, our foundation's quiet guardian." Ethan's pulse quickened. The title echoed in his head like an accusation. He remembered how George had spoken to the walls, to the elevator, to the ghosts. Maybe he hadn't been talking to ghosts at all. Ethan stood abruptly, heart pounding. He left his office and walked through the hallways, retracing the same paths from the photos. The place looked identical, only colder. When he reached the maintenance room, he hesitated before opening the door. Inside, the air was thick with oil, dust, and memory. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and on a small table sat a frame turned face down. Ethan lifted it gently. It was the same photo, his father and George, smiling together. A lump formed in his throat. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he murmured to the empty room. For the first time in years, the confident CEO sounded like a son, lost, confused, searching. He set the frame down, hands trembling. In the corner, a small box caught his attention. Inside were dozens of old ID cards, worn and faded, belonging to employees long gone. At the very top lay one with a familiar name, Michael Ward, founder. The back was scratched, but a faint inscription remained. "For George, my brother, in everything but blood." Ethan sank into the nearest chair, staring at the card. The words hit harder than any spreadsheet or speech ever could. His father had called George brother. That made no sense. George had never been mentioned in any family story, not once. Why? Shame? Forgetfulness? Or something deeper? The questions came faster than he could process them. Suddenly, the corporate empire around him felt like a fragile illusion, built on memories he had never been taught to honor. He left the maintenance room in silence, his reflection warping in the polished glass walls. Passing by the old elevator again, he stopped. The caution tape fluttered faintly in the air conditioning, whispering like fabric in the wind. Without meaning to, Ethan placed his palm on the cold metal. It was absurd, but he swore it pulsed under his touch, faint and alive. For a moment, he imagined his father standing beside George, laughing. Then the feeling vanished, leaving only the chill of steel. That night, Ethan returned to his apartment, but didn't turn on the lights. He poured himself a drink and spread the photographs across his desk. In the silence, he could almost hear the echo of George's humming, that same tune from the hallways, soft and distant. The song wasn't just habit, it was memory. Every note carried decades of love, loss, and devotion. Ethan realized then that the man he was planning to replace might have built more of this company than any executive ever had. When the clock struck midnight, Ethan whispered into the dark, "George, what were you to him?" But the city outside offered no answers. Only the wind, brushing against the glass, seemed to reply. A low, wistful hum, like an echo from the building itself. And somewhere in the depths of Ward Enterprises, behind the sealed elevator doors, a faint light flickered, as if the past had just opened its eyes. The building after hours had its own kind of heartbeat. The hum of machines softened, the lights dimmed to a silver glow, and silence stretched across the endless corridors. Ethan stood in the elevator lobby, long after everyone else had gone home. He told himself he was just reviewing security systems. But the truth was simpler. He wanted to see the old man again. Something about George's quiet presence had begun to haunt him. Through the security glass, Ethan spotted George moving through the atrium, his mop gliding in steady rhythm. The light from the floor lamps caught the sheen of the freshly polished tiles, creating shimmering reflections that looked almost like water. George's movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if every stroke were a prayer. Ethan leaned closer, mesmerized by the strange beauty of it. In a world obsessed with speed, George's patience felt sacred. He followed from a distance, careful not to be seen. The old janitor made his rounds methodically, wiping the railings, straightening chairs, checking the locks. Occasionally he paused to look up at the ceiling or to whisper a few words under his breath. Ethan couldn't hear what he said, but his lips formed the same rhythm. Gentle, reverent, familiar. It wasn't just a routine. It was devotion. Ethan's chest tightened, though he didn't understand why. George stopped by a display case near the main hall. Inside were relics from the company's founding days, blueprints, old tools, faded photographs. He wiped the glass slowly, smiling at something within. Ethan stepped closer, hiding behind a column. "You'd like to see this again, wouldn't you, Michael?" George whispered. The name sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it, but tonight it hit differently, like a truth knocking at the door of his memory. The old man continued, voice low and trembling. "He was a good man, hard-headed, but good. You would have been proud of him, you know. He's just lost." Ethan's eyes widened. George wasn't talking to a photograph. He was talking to the memory of his father, as if the walls could still hear him. Ethan's throat tightened. The young CEO who commanded boardrooms now stood frozen, listening to the janitor speak to ghosts. George moved again, now toward the old elevator, the one sealed off by caution tape. He knelt beside it, resting his palm gently on the cold metal doors. "You've carried more than weight," he murmured. "You've carried lives." Ethan stepped forward, drawn by the gravity of the moment. The elevator gave a faint creak, though no power was connected. The sound made both men look up, one in fear, the other in wonder. Ethan turned away quickly, retreating to the stairwell. His heart pounded like the echo of footsteps chasing him. He didn't understand what he was feeling. Guilt, perhaps, or grief for something he hadn't yet lost. For years he had walked these halls like a king. Now he felt like an intruder in his own empire. Every polished surface reflected not success, but emptiness. And somewhere in that emptiness stood George, holding it all together. Back in his office, Ethan poured himself water and sat in the dark. Through the glass he could still see George moving below, small and steady beneath the towering architecture. The contrast struck him. Youth built for speed, age built for care. He found himself whispering, "Why do you stay, old man?" But the sound barely escaped his lips. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows and the city lights shimmered like distant stars. As the clock neared midnight, George finally gathered his tools, his silhouette shrinking in the reflection of the glass. Before leaving, he turned once more to look at the building, his silent cathedral. He touched the wall, nodded slightly, and whispered something Ethan couldn't hear. Then the lights went out one by one, each click echoing like a heartbeat slowing down. Ethan sat motionless, the last witness to a ritual of farewell. When he finally rose to leave, Ethan paused at the elevator lobby once more. The caution tape fluttered faintly in the air conditioning, casting moving shadows on the floor. For a moment, it almost looked like someone's hand waving goodbye. Ethan exhaled shakily, pressing his palm against the glass. "Good night, George," he whispered again, though the old man was already gone, and in the stillness that followed, the building seemed to breathe. The morning began quietly, too quietly. The usual buzz of screens and footsteps was gone. Only the low hum of the air conditioning filled the office. Ethan arrived early, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change. On his desk, among reports and proposals, sat a small white envelope. No logo, no name. Just slightly creased, like it had been carried in someone's pocket for a long time. He frowned, picking it up with cautious curiosity. The handwriting on the front was delicate, almost hesitant. To Mr. Ward, it read, but the Mr. wasn't clear which one it meant. Ethan hesitated before tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded carefully. The ink had bled in places, the words shaky but legible. It began simply, "Dear Michael." Ethan's breath caught. Michael, his father. He read on, each line slicing deeper than the last. "I wanted to thank you for trusting me when no one else did. You were like a brother to me, and this building became our home. I never stopped watching over your boy, the way you asked me to. He's grown strong, but sometimes I see too much of you in his pride. I hope one day he'll see that love doesn't make a man weak. It makes him remember." The letter stopped mid-sentence. Ink smudged as if interrupted by time itself. Ethan stared at the unfinished words, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Watching over your boy." The words replayed again and again. His mind struggled to connect the pieces. George's voice, the elevator, the photos, the way he'd said your father would be proud. Slowly, unbearably, it all began to make sense. George wasn't just an old employee, he had been there. Always. He read the letter again, this time noticing small stains at the bottom, watermarks, perhaps tears. The letter wasn't bitter or angry. It was tender, full of guilt and care. It wasn't a farewell. It was a confession never sent. Ethan placed the paper on his desk, staring at the shaky handwriting that suddenly felt more alive than anything else in the room. For a man who believed in numbers and logic, this was too human to ignore. Restless, Ethan stood and paced. The walls of his office seemed to close in, every reflection showing a different version of himself. The ruthless executive, the lonely son, the boy who'd forgotten where he came from. "He watched over me," he whispered, his voice cracking. He sank into his chair, gripping the letter like it might vanish if he let go. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a boss. He felt like someone who had failed to say thank you. Later that day, Ethan went looking for George. He checked the janitor's room, the maintenance closet, even the rooftop garden where George sometimes took his lunch. Nothing. The building felt emptier than usual, its silence now unbearable. In the hallway, he found the old cleaning cart, neatly parked beside the wall. On it sat George's cap, the same one from the photographs. Ethan picked it up, running his thumb over the faded stitching. The absence in the air was deafening. He returned to his office and laid the cap beside the letter. Together, they felt like two halves of a story that had waited decades to be told. Outside, the sky had turned grey, thunder murmuring on the horizon. Ethan looked out across the city, lights flickering like distant memories. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered again, but no answer came. Only the soft creak of the building settling like an old man sighing in his sleep. That evening, when most employees had gone, Ethan stood alone in the lobby, staring at the closed elevator doors. His reflection wavered on the metal surface. "You watched over me," he said softly, almost to himself, "and I didn't even know." The words left his lips like a prayer, quiet and ashamed. Then he turned away, unaware that behind him the elevator's light flickered faintly. One slow, gentle blink, like a heartbeat still remembering. When he got home that night, Ethan placed the letter on his bedside table. The city outside pulsed with life, but his world had grown silent. He lay awake long into the night, the letter's unfinished sentence echoing in his mind. Man weak, it makes him remember. Love doesn't make her. As sleep finally took him, Ethan dreamed of a young boy trapped in an elevator crying, and of a strong hand pulling him up into the light. The first thunder rolled across the city like the growl of something ancient awakening. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Ward Enterprises, washing the skyline in streaks of silver. Ethan sat behind his desk, staring at the unfinished letter. Every drop against the window felt like a word he hadn't said, a truth he had refused to face. He rubbed his eyes, but the memories kept flashing. George's trembling voice, his father's smile in those old photographs. The silence was unbearable. By the time he left the office, the storm was in full rage. The streets shimmered under the downpour, neon signs bending in the wind. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, wipers struggling to keep up. But no matter how hard he focused on the road, his thoughts kept drifting. "I never stopped watching over your boy." The line from the letter echoed like a ghost in his mind. His pulse raced, matching the rhythm of the rain on the windshield. Flashes of memory began to surface. Blurred, fragmented images. A child in a small elevator, the sound of screaming metal, a strong hand reaching through the narrowing doors. For years, that scene had existed in his dreams, faceless and vague. But now it sharpened. The man who saved him wasn't his father. It was George. Ethan's grip on the wheel loosened, his breath catching. He whispered the name aloud for the first time. "George!" The car drifted slightly, tires hissing against the flooded street. Lightning split the sky, and for a brief second, Ethan saw his own reflection in the rearview mirror. Pale, frightened, no longer the confident man he pretended to be. "He saved me," he said, voice trembling. "He's been here all along." The realization hit like a wave of grief and gratitude colliding. He pulled over, unable to breathe. The rain thundered against the roof, drowning out everything but his heartbeat. He sat there for minutes, maybe hours, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing in the world. "All these years," he whispered, "and I never knew." His voice cracked. Images of George cleaning the halls, humming those soft tunes, flashed in his mind. Each one a silent act of love he had ignored. Ethan pressed his forehead against the glass, eyes stinging with tears. "I treated him like he was nothing," he said, "and he was the one who kept me safe." Thunder boomed again, shaking the car. Lightning illuminated the office tower in the distance, standing tall against the storm. Ethan stared at it through the rain, the monument to his ambition, now looking like a tomb of memories. "I have to. Find him," he said suddenly, his voice steadying. He started the car and pulled back into the flooded road, guided not by reason, but by something older, the pull of unfinished love. As he drove, the storm seemed to follow him, roaring in fury. Streets turned into rivers, traffic lights blinked weakly through the downpour. But Ethan didn't stop. He could almost hear George's voice through the storm, whispering, "You've grown strong, but don't lose your heart." Each word pushed him forward. By the time he reached the building, lightning struck nearby, lighting the sky like daylight. The rain had washed the world clean, except for the weight in his chest. Ethan ran inside, dripping wet, breath ragged. The lobby was dark, the power flickering. "George!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the hollow halls. No answer. Only the hum of emergency lights and the faint sound of rain seeping through the roof. He ran past the elevator, still taped, still silent, and down the corridors where George used to work. The sound of his footsteps was frantic, desperate, like a heartbeat pounding through the empty building. He burst into the janitor's room, expecting to find him there. Instead, the space was empty. The cart, the tools, everything neatly in place, except for a small lamp left on the workbench. Next to it lay a folded cloth, and beneath it, a photograph. Ethan picked it up with trembling hands. It was his father, holding him. As a child, with George standing beside them, his throat closed. "You never stopped watching," he whispered, voice breaking. "You never left." Lightning flashed again, flooding the room in white light. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he saw a shadow move by the door, a silhouette, stooped but familiar. He turned, heart racing. "George!" But the hallway was empty, the sound of rain the only reply. Still, the air felt alive, as though the building itself was breathing beside him. And in that moment, Ethan understood. Some presences never truly leave. They simply wait to be remembered. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the city still glistening from the night's storm. Ethan barely slept, the sound of rain still echoing in his head. He arrived at the building before sunrise, hoping, praying, that George would be there, humming softly like always. But as he stepped into the lobby, his hope faltered. The place was too quiet. The air felt still, heavy with the kind of silence that follows something final. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, revealing the faint traces of footprints across the freshly polished floor. Ethan followed them, heart pounding. "George!" he called, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer. The faint scent of cleaning soap lingered, mixed with something else, the sterile smell of goodbye. The mop bucket sat neatly against the wall, water still rippling inside it, as if it had been used only moments ago, but the old janitor was nowhere in sight. Ethan moved through the hallways, checking every room. The office doors were locked, the desks untouched. When he reached the elevator lobby, he froze. George's cleaning cart stood parked beside the broken elevator, perfectly aligned like always. But this time, something rested on top. George's old cap, folded neatly beside a faded photograph. Ethan's fingers trembled as he picked it up. The picture showed his father smiling proudly with his arm around George and a small boy, himself. The weight of memory crushed him. He sank to the floor, staring at the photo through blurred vision. "You were there," he whispered. "You were always there." His voice cracked in the empty hall. The building, once humming with energy and ambition, now felt like a tomb, filled not with ghosts, but with gratitude left unspoken. Ethan pressed the cap to his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a son who had just realized he'd been loved all along. The silence deepened, wrapping around him like fog. He tried to stand, but his legs refused. Instead, he stayed there, sitting beside the cleaning cart, surrounded by the faint hum of the old lights, his mind flooded with memories he didn't know he still had. The smell of floor wax, the sound of laughter in these same corridors, a yee-ee. Gentle voice telling him, "Careful there, young man." The pieces of his childhood, long buried, began to surface like forgotten treasures. Finally, Ethan rose and began searching again, calling George's name through every hallway, every stairwell. His voice echoed, desperate, pleading. He checked the security room, empty, the cafeteria, dark, even the rooftop, where the wind howled like a living thing. Nothing. It was as if George had vanished into the very walls he loved. But Ethan couldn't accept that. "He's here," he murmured, pacing. "He has to be here." The building didn't answer, but something inside it seemed to listen. He returned to the maintenance room, hoping for a clue. On the workbench lay George's toolbox, still open, tools neatly cleaned and arranged. A thermos of coffee sat beside it, untouched but still faintly warm. Ethan picked it up, hands trembling. "George," he whispered, voice breaking, "where did you go?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt aware, like the building itself was holding its breath, refusing to speak the truth. Then came the faintest sound, a metallic creak from below. Ethan's head snapped up. It came from the basement where George kept his supplies. The sound repeated, soft but deliberate, like a door moving slowly on its hinges. He hesitated only a moment before running toward the stairwell. The air grew colder as he descended, the lights dimming with each step. The smell of oil and damp concrete filled his lungs. "George!" he called again. No answer, only the echo of his own voice. When he reached the bottom, the basement was cloaked in shadows. A single bulb flickered weakly overhead, illuminating the narrow path between stacks of old equipment. At the far end, he saw a faint glow, warm, golden, alive. He took a step closer, then another, drawn toward it like a moth to flame. "George!" The glow
His voice
flickered
was barely
once
a whisper
more,
now.
and he thought he saw movement, a silhouette, hunched and still. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he took the final steps. The air felt thick, charged, almost reverent. And then he saw him, sitting on a stool beside the tool cabinet, illuminated by a small desk lamp. George's head was bowed, hands resting gently on his knees. For a moment, Ethan thought he was asleep. "George," he whispered again, barely breathing. The old man stirred, raising his head slowly, his eyes soft and tired. "Didn't think anyone would come," he said, smiling faintly. The basement smelled of oil and old memories. The faint light from the desk lamp cast long shadows across the concrete floor, stretching toward the corners like reaching hands. Ethan stood frozen at the doorway, breathing shallowly. George sat beneath the flickering glow, a blanket draped over his shoulders, eyes tired but calm. The hum of the lamp was the only sound between them. For a moment neither spoke, as if words might break the fragile air, holding them together. Ethan stepped closer, every footfall echoing softly. "George," he said, barely above a whisper. The old man looked up, his gaze gentle and knowing. "You shouldn't be down here, son," he murmured, voice trembling with fatigue. Ethan's throat tightened at the word son. He hadn't been called that in years. "I came to find you," Ethan replied, his tone breaking somewhere between apology and relief. George smiled faintly, the kind of smile that forgives before it's asked. "I thought you'd gone," Ethan continued, kneeling beside him. George chuckled, though it came out as a wheeze. "Old bones like mine don't go anywhere fast," he said. "Just needed a place to rest." His hands shook as he adjusted the blanket, veins tracing stories across his skin. Ethan noticed the framed photo from earlier resting on the table, his father's arm around both of them. The sight made his chest ache. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. George's eyes softened. "Would you have listened?" The question hung in the air, like dust in sunlight. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he looked around, the shelves lined with polished cans, tools, and memories of decades spent in quiet service. This basement wasn't just storage. It was George's world, the last place that still felt alive to him. "You kept everything running," Ethan said quietly. "Even when we forgot you." George shrugged. "It's what I promised your father, to keep his building breathing, to keep you safe." The words struck deep. Ethan blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. "He made you promise that?" he asked. George nodded, eyes distant. "The night before the accident, he said, Look after the boy. He'll need more than money to grow. He'll need heart." The old man coughed, voice fading into a whisper. "So I stayed. Every day, every night, even when the company changed, even when you stopped remembering." Ethan's jaw trembled. He wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but the words stuck like stone in his throat. George's breathing grew shallow, each inhale a fragile effort. Ethan reached out instinctively, steadying him. "You should be in a hospital," he said urgently. George shook his head, a faint smile returning. "Hospitals are for the living." "I'm just visiting the end, son." Ethan's heart shattered. "Don't talk like that," he said. But George's eyes had that quiet acceptance, the kind that comes from a man who's made peace with his story. "Every janitor knows," he whispered. "Sooner or later the lights go out." The lamp flickered, casting the room in brief darkness before glowing again. Ethan sat beside him on the cold floor, shoulders touching. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, sacred. Ethan finally broke it. "You saved my life," he said softly. George turned to him, a faint sparkle in his eyes. "And you gave mine meaning," he replied. The words hit Ethan like thunder, simple but infinite. He could only nod, tears finally escaping down his face. Minutes passed. The sound of rain above softened, replaced by the steady rhythm of George's slowing breaths. Ethan wiped his face and reached for the old man's hand. It was cold, calloused but familiar, the same hand that once pulled him from danger. "Rest, George," he whispered. "You've done enough." George smiled again, eyes glistening. "Just promise me one thing," he said weakly. "Don't let this place forget us." Ethan squeezed his hand. "I won't, I swear." George's head tilted slightly, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if watching something far away. "Good," he murmured. "Then I can finally go home." The light flickered once more, a single bulb fighting the dark. Ethan felt the weight of the old man's hand grow still in his palm. "George," he whispered. No answer. Only the hum of the lamp, steady and low, like the building itself was breathing for him. Ethan closed his eyes, grief pressing against his ribs like a vice. He stayed there beside him until the first light of dawn touched the basement window. Dust sparkled in the beam like tiny souls dancing in the air. Ethan didn't move. The city outside began to wake, oblivious. Inside, a lifetime of silence finally broke. "Thank you," he whispered, voice trembling, "for everything." The words echoed softly through the concrete room, then faded, leaving only the warmth of memory. Somewhere above, the building creaked, as if nodding in farewell. The basement was still, the light from the single lamp painting the walls in a soft amber glow. Ethan sat beside George, holding his hand, unwilling to let go. The air was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and something sacred, the quiet before a final truth. George stirred, eyes fluttering open once more. "You're still here," he said, voice barely above a breath. Ethan nodded. "I'm not leaving you." George smiled faintly. "Good. I've been meaning to tell you something." For a moment neither spoke. The hum of the old lamp filled the silence like a heartbeat. George's gaze drifted toward the elevator shaft, visible through a small window. "Do you remember the storm?" he asked softly. Ethan frowned. "The one last night?" George shook his head. "No, the one when you were little, the night everything changed." Ethan's breath caught. His mind flashed, a memory of screaming metal, his father's voice, and a hand reaching through the elevator doors. His hand tightened around George's. "I remember flashes," Ethan whispered. "I was trapped. Someone pulled me out." George nodded, eyes glistening. His words hung in the air, heavy and gentle at once. "Your father had gone back to get something he'd forgotten. When the power failed, you were in that elevator." He ran for help, but I was closer. I pulled you out just before the cable snapped." He paused, breath trembling. "By the time your father came back, it was too late." The shaft had collapsed. Ethan's chest tightened as the truth settled in, sharp and slow. "You saved me," he whispered. George's eyes met his. "And I couldn't save him." The confession broke something inside Ethan. A grief he didn't know still lived there. Tears spilled freely now, unstoppable. "You carried that alone?" he asked. George nodded weakly. "Your father was my best friend. I promised him I'd watch over you. I didn't just stay for a paycheck, son. I stayed because I loved him. And you." The words shattered every wall Ethan had built around himself. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against George's hand. "All this time," he said, voice cracking, "all this time I treated you like a stranger." George's hand trembled as he brushed Ethan's hair back, just as he'd done when Ethan was a boy. "You were hurting," he whispered. "You didn't forget me out of cruelty. You forgot because the world told you that success means leaving things behind. But some things," he smiled softly, "are worth staying for." Ethan lifted his head, eyes red and shining. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" George chuckled weakly. "Because you weren't ready to listen. Some truths have to find you, not the other way around." The old man coughed, his voice fading. "I didn't want pity. I just wanted to make sure you had what your father wanted for you. A future." Ethan swallowed hard, shaking his head. "I thought I was building one," he said bitterly. "But I think I've been building a cage." George squeezed his hand faintly. "Then tear it down," he said. "Remember who you are, not what they made you." His voice trembled but carried warmth, like a father scolding a child with love. "This building, these walls, they're not your empire. They're your inheritance, built with hands, not machines." Ethan nodded, tears falling silently. "I'll fix it," he whispered. "I'll make it right." George smiled. "You already are." Minutes passed like hours. The hum of the light faded in and out, matching the rhythm of George's breaths. Ethan stayed close, afraid that if he blinked, the moment would disappear. "You know," George said softly, "your father used to say you'd change the world one day." Ethan managed a faint smile. "He was wrong," he replied. "You did." George chuckled weakly, his chest rising and falling. "Maybe," he whispered, "but I needed someone to sweep after me." The old man's laughter faded into a soft sigh. His hand grew lighter in Ethan's grasp. The lamp flickered again, dimming slowly, its glow spreading thin across the walls. Ethan felt panic rising, shaking his head. "No, George, stay with me." George's eyes opened one last time, filled with peace. "Don't cry, son," he murmured. "You gave me what I wanted most, to not be forgotten." The words left his lips like a prayer carried by breath. And then, silence. Ethan sat there for a long time, hand still clutching the one that had once saved his life. Outside, dawn began to rise, spilling light through the small basement window. Dust danced in the golden beam, floating like spirits set free. Ethan didn't move. He just breathed, letting the silence fill him. For the first time, the building didn't feel empty. It felt alive. It remembered. And so did he. The morning sun slipped gently through the basement window, scattering golden dust across the floor. Ethan still sat beside George's body, unmoving. The quiet was thick, but not hollow. It carried the weight of something sacred. His fingers remained wrapped around George's hand, cold now, but still strong in memory. The old man's last words echoed softly in his mind. "Don't be afraid to remember." Ethan inhaled shakily, feeling those words settle deep inside his bones. Eventually he stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, reverent. He pulled the blanket over George's shoulders, tucking it neatly just as George had done with every corner of this building for decades. "Rest, my friend," he whispered. The word friend felt too small, but it was all he could manage. His eyes burned, yet his voice was calm. For the first time in years, Ethan spoke not as a man of business, but as a son. "You kept your promise. Now it's my turn." He walked through the basement in silence, touching the things George had left behind. The neatly stacked rags, the labeled bottles, the perfectly aligned tools. Each object seemed to hum with his presence. When Ethan reached the elevator shaft, he paused. The caution tape still fluttered weakly in the breeze from the vent. "You saved me here," he murmured, "and I forgot." He pressed his palm to the cold metal, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. Never again. As he climbed the stairs back to the main floor, the building creaked around him, not as a complaint, but as if sighing in relief. The world above was waking up. Sunlight flooded through the tall glass windows, painting the lobby in gold. Ethan stepped into it, blinking, feeling like he was surfacing from another lifetime. Every sound, every breath felt sharper, cleaner. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a cleaning machine stirred, and he smiled through his tears. He walked to the front desk, where the faded photograph still sat. Gently, he picked it up, brushing a thumb over the smiling faces, his father, himself as a child, and George standing proud beside them. "You gave me back my father," Ethan said softly. "And you gave me a chance to be more than him." His reflection in the glass behind the photo caught his eye, a man who looked both younger and older at once, the kind of man who finally understood what mattered. Hours later, the staff began to arrive. They found their boss unusually quiet, standing in the center of the lobby. "Mr. Ward?" one of them asked. Ethan turned, eyes tired but bright. "There's something we need to do," he said, "before we go back to work." He gestured for them to follow as he walked toward the elevator. The caution tape was still there, fluttering softly. "This stays," he said firmly. "No one touches it. Not yet." His tone left no room for debate. He spent the rest of the day in his office, phone unanswered, meetings cancelled, papers piled up, ignored. Instead, he opened his computer and began drafting something new. Not a proposal, not a report, but a letter. "To the employees of Ward Enterprises," it began. "This company was not built by machines or by ambition, but by hands that cared." He paused, staring at the words, then smiled faintly. It was the first time in his career that a letter felt alive. That evening, as the sun set behind the skyline, Ethan returned to the basement one last time. The air was still, golden light bleeding through the cracks above. He sat beside George again, this time without tears. "You once told me buildings remember," he said quietly. "Then I'll make sure this one remembers you." He reached into his pocket and took out a small metal plaque he'd had engraved that afternoon. The letters caught the light. "George Whitmore, the heart of Ward Enterprises." He fastened it carefully to the wall beside the tool bench, his hands steady now. Then he stepped back, reading the name aloud. "The heart," he repeated softly. "That's what you were." The hum of the old lamp flickered once, a brief, gentle pulse of light. Ethan smiled, wiping his eyes. "Goodbye, George." He turned off the lamp and started toward the stairs, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness like the closing of a prayer. When he reached the top, he stopped and looked back. The basement below was bathed in shadows, yet somehow it didn't feel empty. It felt alive, peaceful, whole. Ethan whispered one final time, "I'll keep my promise." Then he walked into the light of morning, shoulders heavy but heart open, ready to rebuild not a company, but a legacy. And behind him, the building stood silent and shining, as if listening, as if proud. The next morning dawned bright, the kind of day that almost feels undeserved after a night of grief. The city was calm, washed clean by the storm. Ethan stood at the foot of the building, watching the sunlight glint across the glass facade. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. The lobby doors reflected him, not the ruthless executive he had been, but a man softened by truth. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, ready to say goodbye. Inside, the air felt strangely warm. The staff had gathered quietly near the reception desk, whispering. Word had already spread. The old janitor, George, had passed away. Ethan's footsteps echoed across the marble as the room fell silent. He carried a small box in his hands, wrapped in simple brown paper. "We'll be closing early today," he said softly. "There's something we need to do first." No one questioned him. There was something in his voice that silenced everything else. They followed him down to the basement, the place few had ever been. Ethan led the way, steady but pale, like a man walking through a sacred temple. When they reached the bottom, he switched on the single lamp. Its golden glow spread slowly, illuminating George's workbench, the plaque gleaming proudly on the wall. Gasps filled the room. "He kept this place alive," Ethan said quietly. "Every hallway, every light, every memory, we owe to him." He opened the box and carefully removed George's cap, placing it on the stool beside the workbench. Then he laid the photograph beside it, the one of George, his father, and the small boy. "This was his home," he said, his voice trembling. "He didn't just work here. He lived here, loved here." For a moment he couldn't continue. One of the employees began to cry softly. Ethan smiled through his own tears. "He made this building breathe," he whispered. "Now it's our turn to keep it alive." The room was still, the air thick with emotion. Ethan looked around at the faces of his employees, young, ambitious, just as he once was. "George taught me something my education never could," he said, "that a company isn't built by progress but by people. Machines can polish the floors, but they can't make them shine." He paused, letting the words sink in. "From this day forward, we remember him not as a worker, but as our foundation." After a long silence, Ethan nodded toward the elevator. "We'll fix it," he said. "Not replace it, restore it, keep it the way it was." He turned to his engineers. "Every bolt, every panel, it stays." One of them smiled faintly. "It'll take time, sir." Ethan nodded. So did everything that mattered to him. For the first time, the room filled with a small, hopeful warmth. Grief transforming into purpose. When the others finally left, Ethan stayed behind alone. The golden light from the lamp bathed the small space, turning it into something sacred. He sat beside the stool, tracing a finger along the plaque. "I hope you're laughing somewhere," he murmured. "Maybe teasing my father again." The thought made him smile. It wasn't the broken kind of smile he'd worn before. It was lighter, truer. "You were right, George," he whispered. "It's not the work that makes a man. It's the heart he leaves behind." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn key, George's locker key found on the desk. He opened the old metal locker and found a single item inside, a folded note. The paper was fragile, edges yellowed. Ethan unfolded it carefully. "If you're reading this, I guess my shift is over. Take care of the building, and yourself. Remember, kid, floors can shine again, but hearts need tending too." Ethan pressed the note to his chest, eyes glistening. "I will," he whispered. He stood one last time, turning off the lamp. The shadows closed in gently, not as darkness, but as rest. As he reached the stairs, he paused and looked back. The basement glowed faintly in the half-light, the plaque shimmering on the wall. For the first time, the space didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. Ethan whispered one final time, "Goodbye, old friend." His voice didn't echo. It lingered, as if the walls had learned to hold his words. When he stepped outside, the wind caught his coat, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and floor wax, George's scent, still alive in the air. Ethan smiled toward the morning sun, tears shining but no longer heavy. He walked down the steps slowly, each footstep steady, certain. Behind him the building gleamed in the light, alive again, a monument not to power, but to love remembered. Weeks passed, but the building felt different now, warmer, alive, as if every hallway remembered the man who had loved it most. Employees spoke softer, lingered longer. They began leaving fresh flowers by the elevator each Monday, a quiet ritual of respect. The plaque on the basement wall gleamed in the light, the engraved words simple but powerful. George Whitmore, the heart of Ward Enterprises. Ethan visited it every morning before work, never in haste, always in silence. He no longer walked with the sharp stride of authority, but with the calm of someone who had finally learned to listen. His office, once a sterile fortress of glass and chrome, now held life. A plant by the window, old photos restored, the smell of coffee instead of cologne. On his desk sat the letter George had written to his father, framed beneath the glass. Every time Ethan looked at it, the unfinished line reminded him that some stories don't end. They continue through those who care enough to carry them. One morning the company gathered in the lobby for an announcement. Reporters, employees, and even former staff stood shoulder to shoulder, curious. Ethan stepped onto the small stage, no notes in hand, just the quiet conviction in his eyes. Behind him, projected on the glass wall, was a black and white photo of George, mop in hand, smiling, alive. The crowd fell silent. "We're not unveiling a new product today," Ethan began. "We're unveiling a new purpose." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. This company was built by hands that cleaned, built, repaired, and cared. George Whitmore was one of those hands, and today we honor him not with a memorial, but with a future. Murmurs spread through the audience. Ethan continued, voice steady. "We're creating the Whitmore Foundation, a scholarship for workers and their families, because brilliance doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it carries a mop." The crowd erupted into applause, soft at first, then strong and sincere. Ethan stepped back, eyes glistening, humbled by the sound. "If George taught me anything," he said, "it's that success without gratitude is just loneliness in a tie." A few people laughed softly through tears. Ethan smiled. "He showed me that greatness isn't in what we build, but in how much heart we leave behind. And he left enough for all of us." The room stood still in reverent quiet. Later, when everyone had gone, Ethan stayed behind. The building hummed gently, filled with light. He walked to the elevator, now fully restored, and ran his fingers along the brass panel. The reflection staring back at him wasn't just his own. It was layered with memory, with the ghosts that had become guardians. He pressed the button and whispered, "I hope you're proud, George." The doors slid open with a soft chime, not mechanical but almost human. The elevator carried him to the rooftop, where the city stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. Wind brushed against his face, cool and cleansing. He looked out over the skyline, remembering the boy he'd been and the man who had saved him. "You kept your promise," he murmured. "Now it's my turn to keep mine." The clouds parted, and sunlight poured over the glass tower like a benediction. In that moment, Ethan felt peace, the kind that doesn't come from success, but from understanding. That evening he returned home and sat by his window, the city lights flickering below. He opened his journal, something he hadn't touched in years, and began to write. Not about profits, not about strategy, but about people. "A man once taught me that every place has a soul," he wrote. "You just have to listen long enough to hear it speak." The words flowed easily now, free of armor or pride. He smiled, knowing somewhere, somehow, George was still humming in the halls. Before turning off the light, Ethan glanced at the letter one more time. He read the final line aloud, finishing it in his own words. "Love doesn't make a man weak, it makes him remember. And I do." He placed the letter gently beside his bed, the sound of rain faintly returning outside. It no longer felt like sorrow. It sounded like rhythm, like life continuing. Ethan closed his eyes, not to forget, but to remember more deeply. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, reflecting off the tower that now bore a small inscription near its entrance, "Dedicated to those who keep the world shining." People passed by without noticing, but those who knew stopped to smile. And high above, in his office filled with morning light, Ethan Ward looked out at the city, not as a man chasing power, but as one who had finally learned to be grateful. The heart of the building still beat, and now so did his. Final reflection. CTA. Sometimes it takes losing someone who never asked for recognition to remember what truly matters. Ethan Ward had spent his life chasing numbers, power, and perfection. But in the end, it was an old janitor who taught him the most important lesson, that love, loyalty, and gratitude are what keep the world alive. George didn't build skyscrapers or lead boardrooms, yet his hands built something far greater: character. Every floor he cleaned, every light he fixed, every silent act of care was a quiet declaration: I was here. And now, through Ethan's tears, that message finally reached the world. When you think about it, maybe we all have a George in our lives, someone who believed in us when we didn't deserve it, who stayed in the background while we climbed higher. Maybe it's a parent, a teacher, a friend, or someone you never even thanked. So before this story fades into the scroll of your feed, pause. Take one deep breath. Think of the person who helped you stand where you are today. And when this video ends, call them, message them, thank them. Don't wait for the storm to remind you what you already know. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and tell us who your George is. Like the video if you believe kindness deserves to be remembered. And if you want more stories that make you feel, not just watch, hit that subscribe button, because sometimes one story can change the way we see everything. And remember, success means nothing without gratitude, because the brightest buildings still need someone to keep their light shining.